A dirty, hungry child shows up at the gates of an elite country club, carrying a portfolio that could destroy the reputation of the local elite. But no one is prepared for what she's about to reveal. The Charleston sun beat mercilessly on the asphalt as a small figure appeared at the corner of Magnolia Avenue, walking with determination toward the ornate gates of the city's most exclusive club. At first glance, she seemed completely out of place. A child of about 8 years old, clearly in a situation of social vulnerability that was immediately apparent to anyone who looked. Her clothes told a story of hardship and struggle. Jeans torn at the knees with homemade patches, sneakers with separated soles mended with duct tape, an oversized t-shirt that seemed to have come from a donation bin. Her dark hair was disheveled and tangled. Her face bore smudges of dirt that spoke of days without proper bathing, and she walked with the tense posture of someone who hadn't eaten adequately in far too long. But there was something intriguing and mysterious about her presence. Despite her neglected appearance, she carried herself with a surprising dignity for someone so young, her spine straight and her chin raised with quiet determination. And more mysterious still, clutched tightly against her thin chest, she held a weathered leather portfolio, the only item in her possession that suggested any value or importance whatsoever. As she approached the imposing gates of the Magnolia Hills Country Club with their intricate ironwork and gold-leafed magnolia decorations, some passers-by observed her with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. What could a child clearly living on the streets be doing in this neighborhood of mansions and million-dollar properties? The contrast was jarring and unsettling to those accustomed to the manicured perfection of Charleston's elite district. The morning air was thick with humidity and the scent of magnolia blossoms. But underneath lay the tension of a community built on carefully maintained boundaries and unspoken rules about who belonged where. Bradford Whitmore III conducted his daily inspection walk through the club grounds at exactly 1:55 p.m., just as he had done for 15 years since assuming administration of the family property. At 52 years old, he considered himself the guardian of century-old traditions and standards of excellence that simply could not be compromised under any circumstances. This was more than just a job to Bradford. It was a sacred trust passed down through generations of Whitmores who had built their legacy on the foundation of exclusivity and proper social order. Every perfectly manicured blade of grass, every gleaming surface in the clubhouse, every detail of member service reflected not just on the club, but on his family's reputation and standing in Charleston society. It was during this sacred routine that he spotted the incongruous figure approaching the main gates like a stain on his perfect world. For a moment, Bradford was genuinely perplexed and disturbed by what he was seeing. How had a child who was so obviously homeless managed to make it this far into the neighborhood? The area had discreet but efficient security, doormen at the main entrances, and a general understanding among the community about maintaining certain standards. How had this situation been allowed to develop and reach his doorstep? "Hey, you there!" he shouted, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience as he accelerated his pace toward the gates. "Get away from here immediately. This is a private club, not some kind of shelter or soup kitchen." The girl stopped walking but didn't retreat or cower as he had expected. Instead, she straightened her small shoulders and replied with a politeness that was both surprising and somehow infuriating to Bradford. "Good afternoon, sir," she said with careful pronunciation that suggested education despite her appearance. "I have an appointment scheduled with Mrs. Catherine Pemberton at 2 o'clock. Bradford's laugh was harsh and echoed across the perfectly manicured gardens like the bark of an aggressive dog. "Catherine Pemberton. You claim to know Catherine Pemberton?" He examined her from head to toe with obvious disdain, taking in every detail of her shabby appearance with growing incredulity. "Little girl, Catherine Pemberton is one of the most respected ladies in all of Charleston society. She would never, under any circumstances, arrange to meet with someone like you." "But I really do have an appointment," the child insisted, though her voice was beginning to tremble slightly under the weight of his hostility and disbelief. "She called. She said she had found some important papers and needed to speak with us about them." "Important papers?" Bradford's voice rose with cruel amusement as he threw back his head and laughed even louder. And what exactly would these supposedly important papers be about? Let me guess. Perhaps some relative of yours used to work here as a gardener or janitor? Maybe cleaned the bathrooms or washed dishes in the kitchen? The girl pressed the portfolio more tightly against her chest, her knuckles white with the intensity of her grip. No, sir. It's about this place. About this building and its history. This building? Bradford's amusement transformed into sharp irritation and something approaching anger. And what could a little street urchin possibly know about the distinguished history of Magnolia Hills Country Club? I know more than you might imagine, sir, she replied with a quiet confidence that surprised him and made him deeply uncomfortable in ways he couldn't quite articulate. Bradford studied the child with more attention than he had initially given her, his business instincts finally overriding his prejudices enough to notice details he had missed. There was something in her dark eyes, a determination, a certainty that didn't match her vulnerable appearance or desperate circumstances. And that portfolio she clutched so protectively, it was clearly old and well-made, crafted from quality leather that had aged and weathered with time, suggesting it had once belonged to someone of means and education. "What papers are these exactly?" he asked, his curiosity momentarily overcoming his irritation and need to remove her from the premises as quickly as possible. The girl hesitated for a long moment, clearly weighing her options and gathering her courage, then slowly began to open the portfolio with trembling fingers. "They're documents about who really designed this place, sir. About the true architect." "Who designed it?" Bradford's laugh returned, but this time with slightly less conviction than before, a note of uncertainty creeping into his voice. "Everyone who matters knows it was Harold Morrison, one of the most respected architects in the entire South. That's documented historical fact, recorded in every official record." "That's what everyone has been told to believe," the child said with calm certainty that was unnerving in someone so young. "But the documents in here tell a very different story about what really happened." Bradford instinctively took a step backward when she attempted to show him the contents of the portfolio, as if physical proximity to whatever she carried might somehow contaminate him or compromise his position. "I don't want to see anything you might have found or stolen from somewhere else. You have exactly 5 seconds to remove yourself from my property before I call security and have you forcibly removed." "Please, just listen for one moment," the girl pleaded, her composure beginning to crack under the pressure of his hostility. "Mrs. Pemberton knows about these documents. That's precisely why she arranged this meeting with me today. Catherine Pemberton would never—" Bradford began with renewed confidence, but was interrupted by the distinctive sound of an expensive engine approaching the gates with the quiet purr that only the finest automobiles could produce. A vintage Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow, its silver paint gleaming like liquid mercury in the afternoon sun, glided to a graceful stop directly in front of the main gates. The uniformed chauffeur emerged with practiced efficiency and opened the rear door with a respectful bow, from which stepped an elegant woman of nearly 90 years, moving with the unmistakable authority of someone born and bred to command immediate respect from everyone around her. Catherine Pemberton surveyed the scene before her with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. Bradford, clearly agitated and defensive, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment, and a small child holding what appeared to be an old portfolio, and she immediately understood the dynamics of the situation unfolding before her arrival. "Bradford," she said with a voice that cut through the humid air like finely tempered crystal, each word precisely enunciated and carrying the weight of generations of social authority, "I certainly hope you haven't been disturbing my invited guest." "Your guest?" Bradford blinked rapidly, his confidence evaporating like morning mist as confusion replaced his earlier certainty. "Mrs. Pemberton. Please look at her carefully. She obviously doesn't belong in a place like this. Her clothes, her general appearance, her entire presentation reflect temporary circumstances, not permanent character," Catherine replied with ice-cold precision that could have frozen the humid Charleston air. "And you might be quite surprised to learn how many truly important people don't appear important at first glance to those who judge only by superficial appearances." Catherine approached the girl with measured steps and carefully lowered herself to one knee. completely ignoring the protests of her arthritic joints and the potential damage to her expensive dress. "My dear child," she said with genuine warmth that contrasted sharply with Bradford's hostility, "did you bring the documents we discussed during our telephone conversation?" The child nodded solemnly, offering the portfolio with hands that trembled slightly from a combination of nervousness and relief at finally finding a friendly face in this intimidating environment. "Mrs. Pemberton," Bradford interjected with growing desperation, his voice rising with panic. "Surely, you cannot seriously believe that this homeless child possesses anything of genuine historical value or importance?" Catherine opened the portfolio slowly and deliberately, her experienced eyes scanning the first few documents with the careful attention of someone who understood their significance. She drew in a sharp breath and sighed deeply before speaking. "Bradford, there are things about the history of this property that you simply do not know. Things that I discovered only recently and that will change your understanding and perspective forever." Catherine began methodically spreading documents across the polished hood of her Rolls-Royce, each paper placed with the care of someone handling precious artifacts. A small crowd began to form as the unusual scene attracted attention. Club members who had been enjoying their afternoon activities were drawn by the obvious tension and drama unfolding at the main entrance. "This," Catherine announced, holding up a yellowed document with obvious age and handling, "is a personal letter from Harold Morrison himself, dated March 15, 1958. She read aloud in her clear, carrying voice. "Dear Gus, the architectural plans you created for the Charleston project are truly magnificent in their scope and vision. I deeply regret that the social circumstances of our time do not permit you to receive the public recognition and credit that you so richly deserve for this exceptional work." Bradford's face drained of all color as the implications of the letter began to sink in, his confident worldview cracking like thin ice under sudden pressure. That simply cannot be authentic. It must be some kind of elaborate forgery. "There is considerably more evidence," Catherine continued with relentless precision, spreading additional documents like a prosecutor building an ironclad case. Photographs showing the true architect working on the construction site, personal correspondence discussing secret payment arrangements, and this. She held up an official document bearing multiple seals and signatures. The original deed to this property, clearly showing it was sold for a price far below market value under what can only be described as highly questionable and potentially coercive circumstances. Dr. Margaret Chen, a distinguished architectural historian who happened to be a longtime club member, pushed through the growing crowd to examine the documents more closely. "My God," she whispered, her professional expertise immediately recognizing the significance of what she was seeing. "I have always questioned the unique architectural style of this building. Morrison never created anything nearly this elegant or sophisticated before or after this single project." "Because he didn't design it," Catherine stated with simple, devastating clarity. She turned to look directly at the girl, who had remained remarkably composed and silent throughout the entire revelation. "My dear, why don't you tell Mr. Whitmore exactly who your grandfather was and what he accomplished?" The child took a deep, steadying breath, drawing strength from Catherine's reassuring presence and the growing crowd of witnesses to her story. "My grandfather was Augustus Johnson, sir. He designed every single detail of this entire club complex. But because it was 1958 and he was a black man in the segregated South, he was forced to work secretly through Mr. Morrison as a front. He never received any credit for what he created with his own mind and hands." The silence that followed her words was absolutely deafening, broken only by the distant sound of traffic and the whisper of wind through the magnolia trees. 3 hours earlier, in the small apartment across town, Essie Johnson sat in her worn armchair, watching her granddaughter prepare for what might be the most important day of their family's history. At 76 years old, Essie carried the weight of decades of secrets, injustices, and carefully preserved hope in the deepest corners of her heart. "Come here, baby girl," she called softly to Amara, who was nervously adjusting her clothes for the third time. "Sit with your grandmama for a minute before you go." Amara settled onto the small footstool beside the chair, the same spot where she had heard countless stories about her grandfather over the years. Essie's weathered hands, marked by decades of hard work and struggle, gently smoothed her granddaughter's hair. "I need you to understand something important before you walk through those gates today," Essie began, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had survived segregation, civil rights struggles, and decades of watching talented people be denied their due recognition. "Those people at that club, they're going to look at you and see what they expect to see. A poor little black girl who doesn't belong in their world. They're going to try to make you feel small and unworthy." Amara nodded solemnly, her young face serious with the weight of the responsibility she was about to carry. "But I need you to remember who you really are," Essie continued, her grip tightening slightly on her granddaughter's hand. "You are the granddaughter of Augustus Johnson, one of the most brilliant architects this city has ever seen. Your grandfather's mind created beauty that has lasted for more than 60 years. His hands drew the plans that became the buildings where Charleston's elite gathered to celebrate their achievements." She paused, looking directly into Amara's eyes with an intensity that seemed to transfer strength from one generation to the next. "They took his name off those buildings, baby. They erased him from the history books. They made sure the world forgot that a black man created something so beautiful and lasting. But they couldn't destroy the truth, because I kept it safe all these years, waiting for the right moment." Essie reached for the leather portfolio that sat on the small table beside her chair, running her fingers over its worn surface with the reverence usually reserved for sacred objects. "Your grandfather gave this to me before he died. He made me promise that someday, when the time was right, I would make sure the world knew what really happened. That promise has kept me going through all the hard times, all the years when we didn't have enough money for proper food or decent clothes. But Grandmama," Amara said quietly, "what if they don't believe me? What if they just think I'm making it up?" Essie smiled, the expression transforming her lined face with warmth and fierce pride. "Baby girl, the truth doesn't need anyone's permission to be true. Those papers in that portfolio don't care what color your skin is or how much money you have in your pocket. They speak for themselves, and they speak for your grandfather, who can't speak for himself anymore." She stood up slowly, her joints protesting the movement, and walked to the small window that looked out over their modest neighborhood. "I've watched this city change over the years, watched some barriers come down while others stayed standing. But I've learned something important. Sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one nobody expects to have any power at all." Turning back to her granddaughter, Essie's voice took on the tone of someone passing down essential survival wisdom. "When you walk through those gates today, don't you dare apologize for who you are, where you come from. Don't you dare act ashamed of these clothes or this address. You carry the legacy of a brilliant man who was denied his rightful place in history. You are not going there as a beggar asking for charity. You are going there as the rightful heir to a legacy that was stolen." Amara absorbed every word, feeling something solid and unshakable settling in her chest, a foundation of pride and purpose that no amount of hostility could undermine. "And remember," Essie added, kneeling down to her granddaughter's eye level, "your worth has nothing to do with what they think of you. Your grandfather's genius doesn't depend on their recognition. The truth doesn't become less true because people don't want to hear it. You walk in there knowing exactly who you are and what you carry, and you let that portfolio do the talking when words aren't enough." As Amara prepared to leave, clutching the portfolio that represented decades of hidden history, Essie called out one final piece of wisdom. "Baby girl, sometimes the most important doors are the ones that try to stay closed. You just remember, you're not there to ask permission to matter. You're there to remind them that you always did." Bradford looked desperately around the growing crowd, his face cycling through disbelief, anger, and the first cold touches of genuine fear. The assembled group had swelled to include nearly 30 people now. Club members, staff, a few passers-by who had been drawn by the commotion, and several individuals who had their phones out, clearly recording everything that was being said and done. "This is absolutely impossible," Bradford stammered, but his voice had lost all its earlier authority and conviction, reduced to the desperate protests of a man watching his entire world collapse in real time. "The official documentation," The historical records, everything we know? Official documentation, interrupted a new voice with the calm authority of academia, can sometimes be incomplete, deliberately misleading, or even entirely fabricated when powerful interests are involved. Everyone turned to see Dr. Harrison Wright from the University of Charleston approaching the group with a thick folder of documents tucked under his arm and the confident bearing of someone who had spent weeks researching and verifying facts. Catherine acknowledged him with a slight nod. Dr. Wright has spent the past week meticulously authenticating these documents using every available scientific and historical method at the university's disposal, she explained to the increasingly captive audience. His findings are quite comprehensive and, I must say, deeply disturbing in their implications. Dr. Wright opened his folder and began displaying additional evidence with the methodical precision of a scholar presenting groundbreaking research. I can confirm with absolute certainty that every document in this portfolio is completely authentic, he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the crowd. Furthermore, our extensive research in the city archives, county records, and private collections has revealed a systematic pattern of what can only be described as intellectual theft and economic coercion targeting talented African American professionals during the segregation era. Bradford's eyes darted frantically around the circle of faces, searching for any sign of support or sympathy, but finding only expressions that ranged from shock and horror to what looked disturbingly like righteous anger. The careful social order that had defined his entire existence was disintegrating before his eyes, and he seemed powerless to stop the collapse. But this would change absolutely everything, he whispered, his voice breaking with the weight of realization. The entire history of my family, the legacy of this club, everything we've believed and built our reputation upon. Yes, Catherine agreed with devastating calm, her words falling like hammer blows on the coffin of Bradford's former certainty. It would change everything. The question that now faces you, Bradford, is whether you're prepared to live with an uncomfortable truth or whether you'll continue clinging to a comfortable lie. In the hours that followed the revelation at the gates, the story spread through Charleston like wildfire, jumping from tree to tree in a drought-stricken forest. The Charleston Post and Courier immediately published a special online edition with the explosive headline, "Hidden History Exposed. Local Girl Reveals Decades-Old Architectural Conspiracy." Television news crews from local stations began arriving within hours, followed by reporters from regional and national outlets who recognized the broader implications of the story. Bradford found himself trapped in the eye of a hurricane of controversy that he could never have imagined when he woke up that morning. His phone rang constantly with calls from club members demanding explanations, clarifications, and immediate action. Some were supportive, suggesting that the whole thing was some kind of elaborate hoax or shakedown attempt, but a disturbing number were coldly furious, viewing his handling of the situation as incompetent at best and potentially criminal at worst. The crisis deepened exponentially when other descendants of families who had lost properties, businesses, and recognition during the segregation era began emerging from the shadows of history, many carrying their own carefully preserved documents, photographs, and family stories of systematic injustice that had been buried for decades. What had started as a single girl's quest to honor her grandfather's memory was rapidly becoming a comprehensive reckoning with Charleston's deliberately forgotten past. Media attention intensified when architectural historians from universities across the South began examining other buildings supposedly designed by Harold Morrison and his contemporaries, looking for similar patterns of appropriated work and stolen credit. The implications were staggering. If this level of fraud had occurred in Charleston, how many other cities harbored similar secrets? 6 months after that life-changing afternoon at the club gates, the property that had once been the exclusive Magnolia Hills Country Club had been completely transformed into the Augustus Johnson Community Center for Arts and Architecture. The change was extraordinary not just in its speed, but in its comprehensiveness and the genuine community support that made it possible. Bradford Whitmore, facing multiple lawsuits ranging from fraud to violations of civil rights laws and experiencing complete social ostracism from the very community that had once celebrated his family's legacy, had been forced to sell the property and most of his other holdings to pay legal fees and settlement costs. The buyer was a consortium of community organizations, historically black colleges, and arts foundations, with significant financial backing from former club members who were genuinely horrified by the injustice that had been perpetrated in their names. The girl who had once been dismissed as a homeless vagrant, now publicly known and celebrated as Amara Johnson, stood confidently on the stage of what had formerly been the club's exclusive ballroom, now converted into a community theater and lecture hall. She wore a simple but new dress that she had purchased with her own allowance from the Augustus Johnson Foundation, established with funds from the legal settlements and dedicated to supporting underrepresented students in architecture, engineering, and design fields. 6 months ago, she addressed an audience of 200 people including community members, students, journalists, and civil rights advocates. I was just a girl with dirty clothes whom nobody wanted to hear from or take seriously. Today, I stand here not because I changed, but because the truth finally found its voice and people finally found the courage to listen. She held up the same weathered leather portfolio that had started everything, but now it contained something new alongside the historical documents, dozens of her own architectural sketches, building designs, and plans for community spaces that could serve people from all backgrounds and economic levels. My grandfather, Augustus Johnson, never got to see his name on the buildings he designed with his brilliant mind and talented hands, she continued, her young voice carrying clearly through the renovated space. But he taught me, through these papers and through my grandmother's stories, that truth is worth more than comfort, that dignity doesn't depend on other people's approval, and that real value comes from what you contribute to the world, not from what the world gives to you in return. 1 year after the confrontation that changed everything, Amara Johnson returned to the gates that had been the site of her family's vindication. But this time, she wasn't standing outside looking in as an unwelcome stranger. She was walking through them as the youngest board member in the history of the Augustus Johnson Community Center, carrying a new portfolio filled with architectural plans for expansion projects that would serve even more young people from underrepresented communities. Catherine Pemberton, now 90 years old but still sharp and actively involved, watched from the main building's veranda as Amara conducted a group of aspiring architects on a tour of the facility that had once excluded people like them entirely. The elderly woman smiled with deep satisfaction, knowing that she had played a crucial role in ensuring that a historic injustice was finally acknowledged and corrected. "You know what impresses me most about this entire transformation?" Catherine asked Dr. Wright, who had become the center's academic director and was standing beside her, observing the afternoon's activities. "What's that, Mrs. Pemberton?" he replied with genuine curiosity. That, in the end, it wasn't wealth or political power or social connections that changed everything, she reflected thoughtfully. It was an 8-year-old girl who refused to accept that her appearance determined her value, or that her family's truth was less important than other people's comfort with lies. Near the main entrance, a bronze plaque gleamed in the late afternoon sunlight, its words a permanent reminder of justice delayed but not denied. Augustus Gus Johnson, 1923-1987, visionary architect whose legacy was preserved and revealed by his granddaughter, Amara Johnson, who taught us all that truth always finds a way to surface and that courage can come in the smallest packages. The gates remained permanently open now, just as the community had promised they always would be. A powerful symbol and constant reminder that sometimes the most formidable barriers can be dismantled by those who seem to have the least power to do so. But who possess the most important power of all? The unshakable conviction that truth and justice matter more than comfort and tradition. And Amara? She continued carrying that old leather portfolio everywhere she went, now filled with her own architectural dreams and visions for a more inclusive future, proving every single day that real worth has absolutely nothing to do with external appearances or circumstances, but everything to do with inner strength, inherited wisdom, and the courage to stand up for what's right, regardless of who tries to silence your voice or diminish your value. Years later, when people asked her about that transformative day at the country club gates, Amara would always say the same thing. I didn't go there to change the world. I just went there to tell the truth about my grandfather. But sometimes that's exactly what the world needs most. Someone willing to speak truth, even when nobody wants to listen. The Augustus Johnson Community Center became a model for similar transformations across the South and beyond, proving that acknowledging painful historical truths, rather than destroying communities, could actually heal them and make them stronger, more inclusive, and more genuinely worthy of pride than they had ever been when built on foundations of exclusion and denial.